So welcome to video 1 of volume 1 of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. BookTube, it's Kim at middle of the book march. And as I said in my intro, this is video number 1 talking about the novel Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, we should have read up through volume 1, and that would be the first 14 chapters of the novel. In my book, which is the Oxford Classics edition, it's 134 pages. And it may seem like a little bit of a quick pace, but I like to get into a book and stay in a book and be immersed in it. And I wanted to finish it on Emily Bronte's birthday, which is Saturday, July 30th. So, let's get going. I want to talk about the first volume 1 of Wuthering Heights. Now, there's a lot of things that are helpful to remember when you're reading this book. Number 1, it is not a love story. And it's often described that way. And there are a lot of reviewers and readers who want to talk about how it is or is not a story about love. And I've watched actually several videos on YouTube with differing opinions. And I've also started to watch a couple of the movie adaptations. And one of the worst ones so far was I think it's 1992 with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche. Oh, that was awful. Awful, because right from the start, I got the impression they were trying to make a love story. And that is not what this book is. So what is Wuthering Heights? It is a Gothic novel, an 1800s Gothic novel. Right on the cusp of being written in the Victorian age, but Emily Bronte wrote a very dark, brooding, solitary, desolate Gothic novel. And what do Gothic novels have in them? Usually ghosts or a ghost story, bleakness, darkness, possibly some sort of anger or loneliness or emotion, and all of that kind of wrapped up together. Wuthering Heights is the perfect setting. She wrote the perfect setting. This takes place on the moors in Yorkshire, an extremely isolated area in the very early 1800s. The book starts off in the present time, which is 1801. And she set this on the Yorkshire moors, where there are two main houses, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Now, in my book, I'm hoping you all have the same thing in yours. I'm trying to keep some pages here. So, I don't know if you have this, but this is a genealogical table. I'm going to cover my face for just a second. Now, this basically works out who the people are, because there are two main families, the Earnshaws and the Lintons. And the Earnshaws, Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw, were the elder Earnshaw family. And Mr. Earnshaw was the one who discovered Heathcliff in Liverpool at what was known to be a slave market and brought him home. The Lintons were the parents of Edgar and Isabella. And they lived in a much finer, more cultivated estate about 4 miles away from Wuthering Heights. But this genealogy makes things very clear, points out the names and the different combinations of all of the same names. So it hopefully makes things a lot simpler to understand. So how does Wuthering Heights start? Wuthering Heights starts from a narrator called Mr. Lockwood. He is the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange, which is the former home of the Lintons. And he is letting this estate from Mr. Heathcliff, who lives at and owns Wuthering Heights. So Lockwood is kind of an intellectual, gentlemanly, a little bit kind of intellectually obnoxious maybe, or a man who believes himself to be a gentleman and feels superior to the people at Wuthering Heights. But he shows up on a rainy night, knocking on the door, wanting to speak to his landlord and introduce himself and kind of be the friendly gentleman around town. But he doesn't realize the home that he's walking into. And so he enters Wuthering Heights, and the first 3 chapters set the atmosphere for this book. Because what happens with Lockwood is he's expecting to speak to his landlord, who he's assuming is another gentleman. And Heathcliff is not, nor has he ever been. And he comes upon kind of an angry, snarling, isolated man with no friendliness, no warmth, no welcoming into his home. And Lockwood ends up having to stay overnight because of the weather. He can't make it back to Thrushcross Grange. I'm going to have trouble with that every single time. And the custom of the time was to put up travelers so they wouldn't have to go out in horrible weather and get hurt or get lost. Or on the moors, the servants in the household would have been terrified that Lockwood could have fallen into a hole and died, or drowned on the moors. So yeah, he ends up sleeping in a chair. He gets attacked by a pack of dogs. He gets angry because there's no hospitality whatsoever. He mistakenly identifies the different residents of Wuthering Heights. Catherine, who ends up, we end up finding out that she is Heathcliff's daughter-in-law. Hareton, who Lockwood assumes is Heathcliff's son and husband of Catherine. He is incorrect. Hareton is not Heathcliff's son. I'm not going to tell you any more at the moment. And then he gets all the relationships mixed up. Based on how Heathcliff is talking to young Catherine and Hareton and how he's treating the servants, Lockwood can't figure out what the dynamics are and what the relationships are. He's very, very put out. So he decides that he needs to stay. He's going to sleep in a chair. The servant Zilla actually brings him upstairs and finds him a place to sleep. And he's kind of beside himself. This place is dark and foreboding. It's not set up as an estate of a cultivated person or family. He's, it's dark and he's kind of wondering what's around every corner. But she brings him up into the room that used to belong to Catherine Earnshaw. Because as we know, Wuthering Heights was once the Earnshaw estate. Now Heathcliff is the one who owns it. And the ghost makes an appearance in the first part of the book where Lockwood has found this sleeping closet, so to speak. He's trying to relax. He found a lot of Kathy's old books. He finds her carving in the windowsill and the writing in her books. Everything is so old, and he's kind of poking around. And he hears a rapping on the window glass, and he figures it's kind of a branch that's making noise on the window. And he decides he needs to stop it. He needs to break off the branch so it's not banging up against the window. But when he goes to do that, he reaches out through the window and a hand grabs his hand. And it's a ghost telling him and pleading with him, let me in, I'm cold, I've been wandering the moors, let me in. And he's of course terrified. He screams out, which brings Heathcliff to the room. And what ends up happening is this was Kathy's room. And Heathcliff is beside himself. He goes berserk. He's yelling and thundering at Lockwood, what are you doing here? Get out of this room. And Heathcliff leaps to the window and he's begging Kathy, please stay with me, show yourself, my dearest Kathy, and he's sobbing, and Lockwood just makes a run for it. So that is the very beginning of Wuthering Heights. It sets a tone that this does not sound like a love story, and it does not sound like a historical famous romance. It's not. And it's interesting because what starts to happen is there are 2 main narrators. One is Lockwood and the other is Nellie Dean, who is the servant and housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange. However, she started off as the housekeeper at Wuthering Heights. So there's 2 really interesting narrators that direct the story. And we find out the story of Heathcliff and Cathy and the Earnshaws and the Lintons based on the story that Nellie Dean starts telling to Lockwood. He ends up going home. He's been out in the storm for 2 nights at Wuthering Heights. He starts to get sick, so he goes to bed, and he wants to kind of record this family history. And Nellie Dean is kind of serving him and nursing him, and he asks her, please tell me the story of these families. And so she proceeds to do that. So the scene is set. The scene of the solitary nature, the isolation of these 2 families. And in the very beginning of chapter 1, volume 1, there are some specific words that totally jumped out at me. One of them is solitary, a perfect misanthropous heaven, and desolation, and all of those words describe the atmosphere on Wuthering Heights. Lockwood describes Heathcliff like this, but Mr. Heathcliff forms a singular contrast to his abode and style of living. He is a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman, that is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire, rather slovenly perhaps, yet not looking amiss with his negligence, because he has an erect and handsome figure, and rather morose. Probably some people might suspect him of a degree of underbred pride. And that is a definite foreboding of the beginning of the story of Wuthering Heights. When Lockwood finally kind of escapes Wuthering Heights, goes back to the Grange and is sick in bed and being nursed by Nellie, we start to hear the story in the background. As most of us know, Heathcliff was a foundling. He was brought home by Mr. Earnshaw. He was supposedly going to be the new brother of Cathy Earnshaw and her brother, and I always forget his name, Hindley. And Hindley is the older brother. Hindley does not want to have the competition of this new little brother, but Cathy at first is suspicious of Heathcliff, but to her he's a novelty. So they become like little siblings. They play together, they stay together, they are always together in the house. They escape to the moors together, and through the amount of time spent together in their childhood, they form a extremely strong and obsessive relationship, a bond, and they start to become unable to tell which is which. They start to form almost one soul, and that's kind of how they describe each other, that they are each other's souls. However, this is not a good situation, because eventually Mr. Earnshaw dies and Hindley becomes the master of the estate, and he forbids Heathcliff to remain a member of the family. He is exiled to the barn. He is going to be a stable boy, a servant. He's not allowed to be with Cathy. Hindley wants to forbid Cathy from being with Heathcliff, but eventually they just continue to gravitate around each other. Heathcliff is abused. He is treated poorly. He is not given enough to eat, to wear. He's not taken care of. He's not regarded by Hindley. But Cathy, whenever possible, and Heathcliff gravitate towards each other. And because of the abuse that they're both suffering at Hindley's hands, they are making plans to escape it. And all they want is to be together and to stay together. But throughout the beginning of the book, as the reader is kind of reading these situations and the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff, and the whole time, all of the descriptions of Heathcliff are his dark eyes and the stare in his eyes. He doesn't have regular emotional reactions to being abused or being beaten or starved. It's almost as if the reader can see that he's soaking it all in, and there will be a climax as to what he does with all of that abuse and that trauma. So Cathy is kind of that young girl character who has that wild spirit and can't be and doesn't want to be controlled. She won't be contained. She is a child of nature, and that's exactly what Emily Bronte was. Bronte family lived on the moors. It was right outside their back door, their backyard, and that's where they played. And Emily was very much a child of nature, uncultivated, even though she came from a parson's family, a family where her father was a minister or country parson. So they did have some middle-class standing in the community. Their home was a home of intellectualism. But Emily herself was very much of nature and wild and the physicality. And so Kathy is very much a resemblance of Emily. And we can read very much of Emily's autobiography in the character of Kathy. And I'm going to think that we can also read much of her character in Heathcliff as well. The darkness, the foreboding, the isolation, the individuality, because Emily as a woman is very similar to Heathcliff in her status as an individual alone. She sinks into her atmosphere. And so that's what we see with Heathcliff and Kathy. There's so many things that I highlighted in the book that there's no possible way that I can go through and read all of these quotes, but there's so many that I wanted to share that kind of describe the characters in the story. A Gothic novel was developed with very similar themes and very direct atmosphere relating to, the foreboding, the foreshadowing, the darkness, the bleakness, ghost stories and hauntings and things that are scary. But another underlying tone of Gothic novels is the sense of women being in dangerous situations, women being consumed by men, or women being held hostage to, whatever emotion or passion, or even physically held hostage. And it also represents kind of that repressed sexual desires. That's why these books were written back in the 1800s. And it's almost as if they were masking that Victorian repression of sexuality. This book was really interesting because the publishing world and readers at the time could not believe that it was written by a woman because of its sexuality, its sexual tone, the passions, the anger, the violence, the sadism that's included in the story. And so back then it was very mysterious and yet interesting when, discovered that it was written by a woman, Emily Bronte. So that's the atmosphere and the tone through the novel. Wuthering Heights is not a cultivated estate like the Grange was, and it matches the inhabitants. Hindley becomes a very dark, dangerous character. He is the one that decides upon his father's death that Heathcliff will no longer be treated as a sibling. And Hindley brings home a wife, Frances, Hindley had been sent to college, and he comes back at the death of his father with a wife, Frances. And Frances is kind of small and spare and bird-like and not a very strong, physically strong or emotionally strong character. But he is devoted to her, and she kind of takes over the position of the master's wife. Eventually she gets pregnant and has a son, but she dies very shortly after that. Once she does, Hindley degenerates into darkness and anger and alcoholism and all of that because his adored wife has now died, and all he has left is this son that he just could care less about. He doesn't want to have anything to do with him. He's a danger to his own son, and his personality and his actions and his tone just degenerate from there. Heathcliff actually saved Hindley's infant son's life because Hindley, in an alcoholic rage, grabs his baby son, walks up the staircase and holds him over the banister and ends up dropping him, but Heathcliff at the bottom catches him and nothing happens to the baby. So that's a foreshadowing of the relationship that develops between Heathcliff and young Hareton, Hindley's son. Eventually, Kathy and Heathcliff are going on a prank, are peeking in the windows at the Lintons' house, and when they're discovered, they start running away, but Kathy is attacked by dogs and her ankle is wounded. So they bring her into the Lintons' estate, but they kick out Heathcliff, and Kathy, in the late 1700s, was not going to be moved, so they nurse her at the estate, the Grange. And it's in that time period that she becomes close with Isabella Linton and Edgar. And by the time she returns home, it's 4, 5, 6 weeks later, and she's become a different person. She's now a cultivated, civilized young woman. And she realizes the attraction of wealth and privilege and all of that and what that brings. And she and Edgar form an attachment. So Edgar and Isabella are visiting Wuthering Heights. They are visiting Kathy. Their relationship starts to develop. Even though Edgar sees Kathy's erratic, passionate, angry personality, her wildness, Edgar is still enamored with her and ends up proposing. One of the biggest scenes in the book, in my opinion, is when Kathy is talking to Nellie in the kitchen. She doesn't realize it, but Heathcliff is sitting right around the corner. Nellie understands that he's there, but Kathy does not. And Kathy tells Nellie, Edgar proposed to me. What do you think I should say? And Nellie, of course, is like, I can't tell you what to do. And do you love him? And she starts to question Kathy. Do you really love Edgar? And Kathy starts to give her all of these reasons why she loves him, but Nellie's like, that's not a good reason. That's silly. That's not a good reason. And Kathy makes a statement that she couldn't marry Heathcliff because it would degrade her to marry him. And at that point, Heathcliff runs from the room. But Kathy goes on to tell Nellie that they are one. I am Heathcliff, is what she says. They are one person. They are one soul. And at that point, Nellie tells Kathy that Heathcliff probably heard her. And he, at this point, has run away. He's gone. And Kathy goes flying out the door, screaming into the rain, trying to find him. She begs everybody to go out looking for him, but he has left. He's gone. So there's a lot of time that goes between that event and when they pick up, because I think it's 2 or 3 years. And all of these events are being narrated by Nellie to Lockwood. And we are getting all of these pieces of information. And it's almost, we're trying to piece together the actual reality that Nellie is telling Lockwood, because Nellie has a very skewed view of the past and the emotions that she carries towards Kathy and towards Heathcliff and also towards Edgar, because Edgar and Kathy get married and Kathy goes to live at the Grange and she brings Nellie with her. So Nellie becomes her housekeeper and her lady's maid at the Grange. And Nellie starts to really respect and appreciate Edgar Linton. So this is where it starts to get really good and dark, because eventually Heathcliff returns. And he returns looking like a gentleman. He's got money. He has grown and he's matured. He has the clothing. He has the bearing. And he shows up at the Grange, and Kathy is enthralled and joyful that he's returned. And she wants to have him and Edgar be friends because she wants to have her cake and eat it too. She basically wants her marriage, but she wants to have Heathcliff's company as well. So she's trying to orchestrate and force this relationship between these two important men in her life. But neither one of them wants to have anything to do with the other one. And we really start to notice the character of each of the characters. Kathy is not a nice person. She's not a good person. Heathcliff is not a good person. Edgar may be, but he still has some anger issues and some secrets that he's hiding from Kathy and things he's not willing to address. And he's not an assertive man. So he doesn't know how to tell her his true feelings of he doesn't want Heathcliff in their lives. He can see the love and the passion that Kathy and Heathcliff have for each other. But she's determined. She's not going to give up either one of them. And she's the one that's causing the conflict. But what she doesn't see at first is Heathcliff is there for revenge. He is obsessed with her. He wants to possess Kathy. But he has come back purely for revenge. He's already been to Wuthering Heights. He has money now, but nobody knows where he got it. And he goes back to Wuthering Heights and finds Hindley, who is a gambler, an alcoholic, has lost his money, is in a precarious financial situation, and is still playing games and gambling. And Heathcliff bails him out and ends up owning Wuthering Heights. So he's gone to the Grange to tell Kathy, I own Wuthering Heights now. And she said, how can this be? But that's his first step towards revenge. He has come back to avenge himself and the treatment he got. Not only from Hindley with the physical and the emotional and mental abuse, but from Kathy, the abuse that she loaded onto Heathcliff by disregarding him, by saying that it would degrade her to marry him. He was not anybody of position. She would be destitute if she married Heathcliff. She would not be looked at as a grand lady of the county. So she wanted the entitlement and the privilege of being part of the Linton family, in the meantime putting Heathcliff down and not even considering the bond that they have. So he is internally enraged by all of this. So he's not there to revisit Kathy and show her his affection. He is there to exact revenge. And as she disregards the signs in front of her, he continues to come to the Grange and visit. He wants to be with Kathy. He wants to look at her face. He wants to talk to her. He wants to touch her. Of course, she's married. But he sees his opportunity in Isabella Linton, and he ends up courting Isabella, or not really the good way of courting. It's not a love story. It's not a romance. But he ends up being the one who Isabella thinks that she's in love with. And he knows in the back of his head, this is my opportunity. This is the perfect way that I am going to exact revenge on this family. And he and Isabella, on a night where Kathy has lost her mind because she threw a temper tantrum because Edgar kicked Heathcliff out of the house, wants nothing more to do with him. And she threw a temper tantrum because that's not acceptable to her. She wants her marriage to Edgar. She wants Heathcliff in her life. So she throws a fit. She goes up to her room, locks herself in, and she's going under a hunger strike. Well, what she does is she stops eating for 3 or 4 days. She starts to go a little mad. And in the meantime, Isabella has run off with Heathcliff and they've eloped. So Kathy is recovering from this madness. Eventually, Nellie gets a letter from Isabella saying, I've run off and married Heathcliff, but he took me to Wuthering Heights. And now Isabella realizes the situation that she has gotten herself in after believing she's in love with Heathcliff. He has brought her back to a shell of an estate. He has no love for her. He actually has so much disdain and contempt for her. He calls her a slut. He could care less how she feels. He only wanted to get initial pleasure from her on their wedding night honeymoon. And now he says he's literally contemptuous of her. And she had written this letter to Nellie, begging her to visit, begging, I need you here. I need to see somebody. And when Nellie gets to Wuthering Heights, Isabella is just a shell of her former self. And Heathcliff is gloating and preening himself in front of this poor wife who he just could care less about. And he basically tells Nellie, you're going to help me see Kathy. You're going to get me into that estate so I can see her whenever Edgar isn't there. You don't have a choice, because if you don't do this for me, I will not let you leave Wuthering Heights. And Nellie kind of gets roped into being the accomplice for Heathcliff to be able to go and see Kathy. And so that's the end of volume 1. But throughout this volume, this whole volume sets the tone of what's to come next, obviously, because that's what the beginning of books do. But we see the characters of each of the characters. We see the innocence of Isabella. She was probably spoiled, very naive, caught up in what she believed was the romance towards Heathcliff. He's brooding, he's mysterious, pays her attention. And who else is she coming into contact with in the middle of nowhere in the Yorkshire moors in her family's estate? Nobody. So she's convinced herself she's in love with him. Kathy, we see her, we sort of have sympathy for her in the beginning of the story, because here she is, this wild child, again, in the middle of nowhere, let run loose by her family, and eventually succumbing to the abuse of her older brother, who basically abuses the entire household. And we kind of have sympathy for her, as we do to Heathcliff as he's younger. But they diverge, their paths diverge, and they become a different mold of themselves. They repress all of the pain and the abuse of their childhoods, and it comes out in so many other ways. Kathy can't be tamed, but she treats others as her combination of playthings, her entitlements. She wants what she wants, and she wants everything, and she's not willing to give anything up. She's not willing to give up the passion of Heathcliff, even though she's married to the man who's providing her this very good life. And Heathcliff becomes a villain, and he shows all of the signs of evil and choices in his life that have consumed him, have consumed any warmth in his heart. So he's not really the hero of the story. He starts off as the protagonist, but he becomes a protagonist in the sense of being the main character in the story. We want to see his devolvement, because he as a character doesn't really evolve or grow. And I can say the same for Kathy. Poor Edgar is kind of a milquetoast, cowardly kind of a man, so there's not a lot of development for him. He has quite the love and adoring looks and glances and feelings towards Kathy, but he doesn't have the same passion that Heathcliff does. And so Kathy has quite a bit of disdain for her own husband, and she calls him names, she looks at him with contempt. He tells her, make a choice, him or me, and she won't do that. She wants to goad him into being the bad guy. She will insult him and look on him with contempt and hate in her eyes, but she's not the one willing to leave her marriage. It's a really twisted and really dysfunctional situation, and these characters feed off of each other in the most negative and dark and dismal ways. So yeah, that is volume 1, and I'm hoping I said everything I wanted to say. I took notes and I made some highlights. There's so many things that, with much more time, this video is already pretty long, but with much more time we could go through different quotes line by line and different themes, and maybe I'll do that in the next video or two. I'll find a few that really are meaningful. And maybe if I go back and look at the ones I highlighted for volume 1, I might bring those up in the next video. So let me know if there's anything more that you wanted to talk about, or anything that you noticed, the themes and the characters and the story, the plot, the points of view. Let me know what you think about all of it. I would love to know if you like or dislike the book, if you're going to DNF it, or if you absolutely love it. So please share everything that you want in the comments below, and we'll have that discussion. And I will see you in the next video on Thursday. We are going to read the first 9 chapters of volume 2. So do that, and I'll have another video on Thursday, and then from Thursday until Saturday and or Sunday, we'll finish the book. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.